We do begin our show this morning with those new developments overnight following that incident along the Poland-Ukraine border, which is threatening to dramatically escalate the military conflict in Europe.
Yesterday, 2 people were killed when a missile fell in a Polish village near the border with Ukraine. This is now the first time the war has spilled over into a neighboring country, a nation that's also a NATO member. These pictures obtained by Reuters from social media appear to show the aftermath of the explosion. NBC News has not independently verified these images. And that's the major question this morning. Whose missiles are these and where were they fired from? Russia has vehemently denied that they are responsible. Poland's president says there's no concrete evidence on who fired the missile, but an investigation is now underway. The incident occurred as Russia launched a wave of strikes across Ukraine, targeting several cities, including the capital, Kyiv, and the western city of Lviv. Speaking on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Indonesia, President Biden said preliminary investigations contested reports that the missile was fired from Russia.
We agreed to support Poland's investigation into the explosion in rural Poland near the Ukrainian border, and I'm going to make sure we figure out exactly what happened. It's unlikely in the minds of the trajectory that it was fired from Russia, but we'll see.
We've got a whole team standing by as we learn more about this developing story this morning. We're going to start things off with NBC News Chief International Correspondent Keir Simmons. So, Keir, first of all, just walk us through what we know right now about this explosion in Poland. What are Polish officials saying, and what are they doing in response right now?
Well, Joe, the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, has just wrapped up a news conference in which he has said, and there are some crucial breaking news lines from that news conference. He says there is no indication that this is the result of a deliberate attack by Russia. No indication Russia is preparing an offensive against NATO, and confirming what we heard a little earlier from President Duda of Poland, saying it's very likely that this missile explosion was caused by Ukrainian air defense. As you rightly set up there, why does this matter? It matters, of course, because Poland is a member of NATO. If this was a Russian missile, if it was a deliberate attack by Russia, well, then that would potentially pull those NATO countries, including the US, into this battle directly, feeling that it had to defend Poland. So I think you can hear right now this morning the sound of a number of NATO leaders breathing out a little bit. It has been an incredibly tense 24 hours.
In addition to what we're hearing from the NATO Secretary General, of course, we have President Biden saying it was unlikely the missile came from Russia. We know a senior U.S. defense official, European government official, also told NBC News that the preliminary indicators suggest a Ukrainian air defense system was involved. So what's been the reaction both from Russia and from Ukraine to all of this?
Well, Ukraine's President Zelensky immediately kind of went on the attack in regard to Russia. And I suppose you could say that that would be expected. What's been pretty stunning, I have to say, is hearing the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov in a call just a little short time ago praising President Biden for his restraint, describing others as hysterical because the U.S. president came out pretty early to say this did not look like it was a Russian missile, did not look like a deliberate attack by Russia. So I suppose you could say that what we're seeing here are positive signs that when something like this happens, and remember there have been a wave of attacks by Russia on Ukraine just in the past day or so, when something like this happens, and perhaps it's inevitable that it would happen, that the NATO members are responding. Another point just to make, and I think it's an important one, Jens Stoltenberg also at that news conference saying, let me be clear, Ukraine is not to blame. Ukraine has the right to self-defense. So that's the second part of what these NATO countries are saying. OK, it may have been Ukraine's air defense, but hold on a second, that doesn't mean that it's Ukraine's fault. The responsibility for what's happening lies with Russia, because it is Russia that is launching this barrage of attacks.
All right, Keir Simmons. Keir, thank you so much for kicking us off this hour. We appreciate it.
All right, joining us now to talk more about this is NBC News military analyst Colonel Jack Jacobs and retired Brigadier General Peter Zwack. He's a global fellow at the Wilson Center and a former attaché to Moscow. So thank you both for being with us this morning. Brigadier General Zwack, let's start with you. What's your reaction to these latest developments on this deadly incident in Poland?
I would echo Kira's statements before. This was inevitable. An awful lot of ordnance flying. This is happening when you get down to the base fact. You have an ongoing Russian invasion, aggression in Ukraine, and at the eve of this near crisis, the Russians had fired another salvo of rockets and drones, basically all over Ukraine. And deep into the west past Lviv. And you had an accident, it looks like. And what I think is notable is that the Poles, the nations in the West, if you will, have not completely right off the back condemned Russia, though an awful lot of skepticism, and have gone into an investigation. NATO. We've seen now the NATO, how the NATO consultation, the decision-making processes go. Everybody's taking a deep breath. It should be a message to Russia to be candid about this, and that's important. And I think only time's going to tell. But it looks like it was a Russian-made, probably Ukrainian missile that errantly flew into Poland. Sadly killed 2 Polish civilians, and now everybody's taking a deep breath and doing the investigation. The rhetoric and the polemics need to go down.
Colonel Jacobs, there's been a lot of talk in the last 24 hours from people about NATO Articles 4 and 5. First of all, explain to us what they are, and based on what we are learning in this quickly developing situation, do either of those articles apply in this situation?
Probably not. The articles are based effectively on the notion that an attack on one member of NATO is an attack on all, and nobody wants to get involved. Nobody in NATO wants to get involved in the war in Ukraine. So that's why there is a sigh of relief, and the rhetoric has come down, and probably will continue to come down. I think what's kind of interesting is that photograph. Anti-aircraft missiles have proximity fuses, so they explode when they get close to the target, have a smaller charge than the kinds of missiles Russia have been firing. So it's unlikely that this is anything other than a Russian missile. There's something else to keep in mind about the Russian missiles, about any missiles. They're programmed to hit their targets, and you don't have to make much of a mistake in programming the numbers into the target acquisition capability of the missile to get it completely wrong. I mean, it can fly 1,000, 10,000 meters in the wrong place and wind up exploding. So we have become inured to the ineptitude of Russian forces. There's no reason not to believe that this missile was just a mistake on the Russians' part, and it was not sent into Poland deliberately.
Well, Brigadier General Zach, we still don't know for 100% certainty who fired this missile, but if it did come from Russia, what options would NATO have here? And do you think the alliance would escalate the situation or try to contain it?
It's difficult to say. I think that paramount is intent. Was it deliberately fired into Poland? The scale, if you will, of the attack. Looks that it was neither, and that's NATO. Depending on the level, will go into consultation. A member will ask, and if it is deemed grave, then they will go into Article 5 proceeding. Attack on one is attack on all. It's not there. That is good news. It is in many ways exercised the understanding of the West and the world that how dangerous this is, but also how focused NATO and the West is, And the fact that these governments in the West, including Poland itself, have tried to lower the temperature, saying, yes, this looks to be Russian-made, but it may have come from Ukraine. That is significant. I'm not convinced if the Russians, something like that had happened with the Russians, they would have admitted the same thing.
All right, Brigadier General Peter Zwack and Colonel Jack Jacobs, thank you both for joining us this morning. We appreciate it.
All right, let's bring in NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli. Mike, good morning to you. So we heard the president say he believes it's unlikely the missile was from Russia. So what more are we hearing from him and behind the scenes from the White House?
Well, Stephen, at this moment, President Biden is making his way back to the United States after this marathon worldwide tour. He was, of course, in Indonesia in the overnight hours when this incident first developed. And it's really striking the fact that the president was surrounded by some of our closest allies at this incredibly fragile, sensitive moment, perhaps the most really perilous moment during this 9-month invasion of Ukraine. So what the president was able to do was immediately convene in person with some of those G7 allies. He also had one-on-one meetings with the British Prime Minister, the new Italian Prime Minister as well. And it really was striking. The first indication that we had that this may have been unintentional, perhaps an errant strike, was from the president himself when he made those comments in the overnight hours. And really, this was a summit, the G20 summit in Bali, in which the White House wanted to stress that the United States was once again at the table leading our coalition, leading our allies at a time when one of those 20 nations, Russia's Vladimir Putin, was not in attendance. So much of the agenda was about how to respond to the continued fallout of Russia's invasion, and the White House is really touting the fact that the president was able to use this moment to really once again showcase the resolve of our allies behind Ukraine at this moment.
Pretty unusual to have those immediate international meetings. So, Mike, how is the president handling this response when it comes to the relationship that we have with Poland and our other NATO allies?
Well, it's so important to note the U.S. relationship with Poland at this moment, obviously at this perilous moment, because as Russia did invade Ukraine, so much of the initial response from the White House and so much of the president's focus was, yes, of course, on the people of Ukraine, but those Eastern NATO allies, especially Poland. Remember, President Biden traveled to Poland in the spring, including visiting near the border of Poland and Ukraine, to really show that the United States would be there for our Polish allies. So one of the first things that President Biden did upon waking up after this strike happened was to call the Polish president, President Duda. We can show a photo as the White House tweeted out a readout of that conversation. The president saying he spoke with President Duda to express his deep condolence for the loss of life in eastern Poland and that they will remain in close touch to determine the appropriate next step as it proceeds. Now, as it relates to NATO, you talked with some of our previous guests about Articles 4, Articles 5, the kind of intensive consultation that's going to be going on at this moment. One of the questions facing the alliance is how to continue to support Ukraine's needs, and if this was an errant situation having to do with Ukraine's missile defenses, what possible steps could be taken moving forward to shore up those defenses to avoid this kind of unintentional escalation potentially in the future.
All right, important questions. Mike Memoli, thank you.
With the midterms only 8 days behind us, it appears the 2024 presidential race has already begun. After teasing an announcement for some time, former President Trump finally made it official last night, announcing a third consecutive run for the White House.
In order to make America great and glorious again, I am tonight announcing my candidacy for President of the United States. This will not be my campaign. This will be our campaign all together.
Let's bring in NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard in West Palm Beach. Vaughn, good morning. Good to have you with us. So Trump's announcement came as the so-called red wave really never materialized during last week's election. There's a good chance Congress is going to be divided for the next 2 years. So why did he announce this run so early, and why did he say he's running again?
Right. There was a question of whether he would postpone announcing his presidential run after that slew of defeats among those Trump-backed candidates in those key swing states like Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. But last night, that was not the case. He's going forward, jumping out ahead of the process before anybody else, whether it be Ron DeSantis or Glenn Youngkin or even Mike Pence jump into the race. Donald Trump making clear that he's in it to win it, and he wants to serve in the White House again. Take a listen to part of his speech last night.
I am running because I believe the world has not yet seen the true glory of what this nation can be. We have not reached that pinnacle, believe it or not. In fact, We can go very far. We're going to have to go far. First, we have to get out of this ditch. And once we're out, you'll see things that nobody imagined for any country.
And to put into context, we are still about 14, 15 months away from what would be the GOP Iowa caucus. But you heard the former president lay down that he intends to do this, and he intends to see this campaign through.
Yep, we are already talking about the Iowa caucus, 14, 15 months away. So, Vaughn, we know the president often likes to talk about the 2020 election. Are there other issues he actually talked about in his speech? What does he want to accomplish if he wins?
Right. This is a former president who, we should know, just under 2 years ago, was at the White House when hundreds of individuals, thousands of individuals converged on the Capitol. He never called the Pentagon for backup, despite his vice president and the entire Congress remaining inside of that building. He was ultimately impeached after the 2020 after he left the White House there. And yet now what he is finding is, amid a slew of investigations into him, that he is still referring to himself as a victim, which he did just last night. I want to let you hear another little clip from him last night, though, because as part of being a victim, he still suggests that he should have been the actual winner of the 2020 election. Take a listen to what he would propose to be the remedy for how voting in America should take place.
To eliminate cheating, I will immediately demand voter ID, same-day voting, and only paper ballots.
Of course, this is an electorate which has taken highly to mail-in balloting, especially over these last years here, and yet the former president continues to make the elections and how they are run a central point of his now candidacy for president.
So, Vaughn, what's been the reaction to this announcement, especially within the GOP in the wake of the midterm elections? And then on top of that, are we going to expect the former president to start holding rallies right away?
There was a notable silence last night from most of the individuals, elected individuals within the Republican Party. Over the weekend, you had Cynthia Lummis, a senator out of Wyoming, suggest that Ron DeSantis should be the future of the party. You had a couple now outgoing governors who suggested that Donald Trump has helped the GOP lose several election cycles in a row. But there's not a groundswell and uprising within the Republican Party to push Donald Trump aside. In large part, there is no rush necessarily for the likes of a Ron DeSantis or a Youngkin or a Pence to jump into the race here. And so Donald Trump is laying that foundation, and he is somebody who has demanded loyalty in the past. We could expect that to take place again. In terms of rallies, there is nothing on the calendar at this point yet. Donald Trump brought up the runoff with Herschel Walker, who was his back candidate in that Georgia primary for the U.S. Senate, is now in a runoff with Raphael Warnock. And we should expect to potentially see the former president and now candidate president go out to campaign in Georgia if he were to go and pick somewhere over the next couple of weeks, guys.
All right. Vaughn, thank you so much.
Sticking with politics now, let's bring in NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Rafa. Ali, good to see you. So NBC News still cannot call the House, but our decision desk estimates suggest Republicans have a good chance at this point. And yesterday, Kevin McCarthy faced a challenge from Andy Biggs for the House Speaker nomination. Now, he was able to get his party's nomination in a vote to 188 to 31, enough to make him Speaker. What does he need to do to get those votes, though, on his side?
Yeah, Stephen, good morning. McCarthy only needed the majority of his conference's votes to win that nomination, but he does need that required 218 to win the speakership. Yesterday, after this vote happened, he did express confidence that by this January 3rd vote, he would be able to win the speakership position. I want you to take a listen to a bit of what he had to say.
If you look at the last two speakers, Paul Ryan, he had at this time had 43, lost 43 votes. Nancy Pelosi had 32 votes, and no one was running against her at that time. Look, we have our work cut out for us, so either we're going to lead as a team or we're going to lose as individuals. And I think at the end of the day, we will lead as a team.
Considering McCarthy has been gunning for the speakership position for almost a decade now, it is really considerable that he was challenged for this position at all. And there are some far-right members of his party that are really making a list of demands in exchange for their support. They haven't been very clear about exactly what those demands are. They're likely things like committee assignments, being able to put a piece of legislation on the floor for a vote with a certain fraction of support for that piece of legislation. We're going to have to wait to see what exactly those demands are. But the ability for McCarthy to eventually get these votes that is needed for him to win the speakership is very likely. At the end of the day, the real gut check here is that Republicans don't have a really reliable backup option to McCarthy that could realistically get these votes instead of him. So that's definitely something we're going to be watching, but McCarthy is likely to get this position if and when we eventually call the Republicans for the majority of the House of Representatives, Stephen.
Yeah, those concessions the far-right members are asking for, that will be interesting to follow. Well, on the Senate side now, Democrats will hold control there, but Republicans are scheduled to hold their leadership vote today, and Mitch McConnell is facing a challenge from Florida Senator Rick Scott. So what's going on there?
Yeah, so during this closed-door party meeting yesterday, Senator Rick Scott, who's also the chairman of the arm of the party that's tasked with electing Senate Republicans, he announced a challenge to Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. He tweeted yesterday, quote, "The status quo is broken and big change is needed. It's time for new leadership in the Senate that unites Republicans to advance a bold conservative agenda. That's why I'm running to be Senate Republican leader." A challenge like this from Scott, who is pretty much on the opposite side of the spectrum from McConnell and has publicly challenged him and his legislation in the past, was somewhat expected, especially after last week we saw this group of Republican senators call for these elections that are set to happen today to actually be postponed until after the December 6th Georgia Senate runoffs. The fact that these elections are still happening today shows that Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell knows that he has the votes to win this. And I want you to take a listen to a bit of what he said as far as his confidence today.
I think the outcome is pretty clear. I want to repeat again. I have the votes. I will be elected.
Again, the gut check here is Rick Scott may have announced a challenge to McConnell. It is definitely the most significant in his 15 years in this position, but the likelihood that Rick Scott could usurp McConnell in this position is very unlikely, Stephen.
Long way to go still for that midterm drama. All right, Allie, thank you.
Time to get a check on your morning news now. Weather.
Meteorologist Michelle Grossman joins us now. Good to see you, Michelle.
Good to see you guys. Happy Wednesday. And we are still talking about the cold blast. It's cold out there. It's going to be cold tomorrow, Friday, and through this weekend. We have two Arctic fronts, so 1-2 punch from Canada, bringing down that bitter blast. Today, the first front arrives. It's going to bring temperatures well below average for this time of year, 10 to 25 degrees below average. That's the first front. Then the second front's going to move through later this week, and it's going to reinforce that shot of really cold air. And we're going to keep this in place at least through the Thanksgiving Day holiday week. So as we go throughout the day, we're going to look at temperatures really chilly this morning. And as we go throughout the day, not warming very far. So it's a coast to coast chill. You can see Salt Lake City, 41 degrees. That's 10 degrees below what is average for this time of year. That cold air extends all the way down to the south. Dallas, Baton Rouge, only in the 50s. Baton Rouge are 16 degrees below normal today at 55, 39 in Burlington, and 59 in Charlotte. So that's today. Then as we wake up tomorrow morning, we're waking up to teens in some spots. Omaha, just 19 degrees tomorrow morning as a low. It's going to feel like 14. It'll feel like the teens in St. Louis and also in Chicago, feeling like just 21 degrees in Cleveland and Charleston, West Virginia. You're going to wake up to temperatures feeling like the teens as well. Also below freezing in Jackson tomorrow morning, just 30 degrees right at the freezing mark in Atlanta. So you could see some freezing conditions in terms of the crops tomorrow morning. Our next frigid blast tomorrow afternoon, we're going to look at temperatures only in the teens as daytime highs. So Billings, Bismarck, Rapid City, 17 degrees in Rapid City, 26 degrees in Minneapolis. That's 15 degrees below average. And you're right around the freezing mark in Milwaukee, 12 degrees below what is typical for this time of year. Then as we go throughout Friday morning, we're looking at temperatures extending into the freezing mark territory in D.C. It's going to feel like 29 degrees, feeling like 25 in Atlanta Friday morning, and it'll feel like 17 in Oklahoma City. But notice Fargo, you're going to feel like 14 below zero. So that certainly is a lot of cold air out there. We're looking at that cold air setting the stage for some wintry weather weather, 12 million impacted by a winter weather alert. We have a lake effect warning that's downwind of Erie, also Lake Ontario, and we're looking up to 3 feet of snow in some spots. It's a messy morning also in portions of upstate New York and New England. We're looking at snow falling. That's where the blue is. And then on the warmer side, we're looking at some rain. It's heavy at times along the coast in New England. Sandwiched in the middle is some mixed precipitation, so a mixture of sleet, snow, some rain. So it's not a great morning there, but that's going to clear out later on this afternoon into the evening. But the Great Lakes, you're going to see your snow ramping up today and then really taking charge tomorrow. Again, we could see up to 3 feet of snow downwind of Lake Erie or Lake Ontario. Back to you guys.
All right. I think those 75-degree temperatures are done with us. Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah, they went away.
All right.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.